Hi everybody, and welcome to Healing Conversations. And we reckon this is episode 18, which feels kind of like a lovely process of partnership between me, Ingrid Gunby, and my lovely friend and co-host Gloria Liebecker. And today we're going to be talking about difficult conversations. What happens for us when we are either anticipating or perhaps suddenly find ourselves in a difficult conversation, how we can support ourselves in those moments, and I guess we thought we might start by talking about what we think of as difficult conversations to give us a kind of a platform to head off into this conversation. So I'm wondering, Gloria, you might like to start by defining what you think of as a difficult conversation.
Well, for me, it has been mainly centered around any perception of conflict. And the more people involved, the scarier it would be, the more difficult it would become. And so that's one of them. I believe for most of us, the difficulty is going to lie in our own history of how we have engaged or not engaged. And so that ever-present past that can be haunting us and we don't even know it, that's what can trigger us in the moment. And all of a sudden we're like, this is a place I was never going to go again, or
Yes.
something like that.
Yes.
Or it can even feel really difficult if there's a perception of a power imbalance.
Yep.
That can make it extremely difficult to have a conversation because we can feel disempowered by the imbalance. And it takes great courage then to be able to give ourselves permission to stand in our own resolve.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how about you?
Yeah, and I'm thinking absolutely to everything you've said so far, and wanting to add also, I think, and it was your comment about power imbalance that prompted this thought for me, that sometimes conversations can be difficult because there's shame involved. You know, say even where there isn't a power imbalance, if I'm feeling ashamed, then it can be very difficult to make, for example, make a repair with somebody. That kind of conversation can be really difficult for many of us as well. And then there's the layer two, where perhaps we haven't just suddenly found ourselves in a difficult conversation kind of out of the blue, but we are anticipating having to have a difficult conversation that feels really scary for the kinds of reasons that you're talking about. Maybe there's a power imbalance, maybe our own history could have created a belief that if I open this can of worms, the relationship's never going to be the same again. You know, so the expectation that ruptures can't be repaired can make a conversation feel incredibly difficult, either anticipating it or when you're in it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely can. So I guess for our listeners or our viewers to even consider, what kind of what are the things that are outside of your window of welcome? And when we talk about a window of welcome, I think we've talked about this on other episodes, where it's like, what emotions are you comfortable with and you stay comfortable with? And what emotions are you just like, no, I'm going to back off of that one. Yeah. We can't tolerate them as easily.
That's right. Either in ourselves or in the person that we're in conversation with. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So, for example, if anger is really difficult, then any flavor of that starting to emerge, either in our own being or in our perception of how the other person is feeling, will start to tip us into either withdrawal or shut down or attack back, or attack preemptively. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, or what it also can do is when that is sparked in us, we can have the experience of just going mute. We
Yeah.
can go into freeze.
Mm-hmm.
Or collapse, a type
Yeah.
of collapse, that our system is just overwhelmed by it. And that can happen without even a word being spoken, because it can be just with the body language. It could be a signal that comes across that signals our amygdala, our emotional alarm center, that we are in danger. Or it could be with the tone of voice, or the inflection, or the cadence. All of these different aspects of communication come into play many times, beneath conscious awareness.
That's right. That's right. And that can often be in play where, I'm thinking of the kinds of awful, unproductive arguments that we can get into, where we end up arguing about, but I didn't say that. There's this mismatch between the technically the words that someone said
Mm-hmm.
and the feeling that's being conveyed, the meaning.
Yeah.
and then particularly if part of what happens for us in difficult conversations is that we tend to shift into our left hemisphere and go all kind of like literal and and rational about what's being said or explored, then you've got a mismatch between the feeling state of what's being expressed in the conversation and the words. And you might well have one person feeling deeply hurt and distressed, and the other person's gone into, but I didn't say that. And it's like we're operating in two different hemispheres or on two different levels, and what do we do then?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess the first point right there would be to begin to develop our capacity to recognize where we are. How do we check in with ourselves? Do we even have a practice of staying present with our own inner experience? Because I know when I was younger, I sure didn't. I just went live, I just get into the thick of it.
Yeah.
And it was not productive most of the time.
No.
Yeah.
No.
It would just make it more difficult going forward.
That's right. More difficult the next time. And layering on those experiences and triggers of this is going to be bad. If we go here, we're not going to be able to find our way out again. And then you've got fear, you've got anger, you've got distress, you've got fear of losing a relationship that might really matter to you. And the intensity of that triggering process just gets greater over time until we can find ourselves some tools and practices that support us to stay present and stay relational even under stress.
Yeah, but there is that accumulation effect. Anytime we experience that reaction or that when we have that perception, every single time we ever had it, it's layered upon, which magnifies it. Yeah. And again, like you said, being able to begin to notice that and notice that you're noticing that, developing the capacity to even slow down your own inner experiences, slow down what your default mode network or your mind is saying to you, so that you can begin to sort it out and have more clarity and be in more choice. Yeah. So calling a pause is one thing I find to be an extremely effective strategy to use.
Yeah, yeah. And how would you notice when you needed to call a pause? What would you notice in your own being that would have you going, whoa, okay, need to call a pause here?
Probably would be holding my breath.
Right.
Not realizing I was. All of a sudden I'm not breathing. Oh.
Yeah.
Or my heart's beating faster.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or maybe I'm trying to disappear.
And for me, I notice it like I probably don't notice, and this would be an interesting thing to explore in a different way, but I I notice tension coming up here. I probably don't notice my breathing so much, although I'm sure if I were attending to my breathing, it would have changed. But it's like my energy is coming up, and I'm not grounded in my body so much anymore. And I'm more in my upper chest and my head, and I'm starting to strategize. So that would be the tell that I have for myself of, okay, I'm starting to get overwhelmed here. I'm not feeling safe. I need to find a way to resource myself before I can engage in this conversation in a helpful way. And calling a pause is fantastic. Sometimes we can't. You know, we might try and the other person's not prepared to pause. So
well, then we can use the strategy I really like also to buy time.
Yes.
We can kind of buy time, and it's not empathizing, it's not trying to fix, but it might be just asking for more clarity.
Yeah, exactly.
And that can help us to have that pause time inside to regroup and to ground ourselves, and to recognize what is up for us.
Yeah, that's right. So when we're talking about requesting more clarity, I'm wondering if we should kind of flesh that out a little bit for people who may not be familiar with what we mean by that.
Sure.
You know, so say you've got I'm really angry with you, and I'm attacking and I'm blaming.
Yeah, so I would be something like, would you be willing to be more specific about what exactly it is that is upsetting you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So being more specific, because many times when we get in blown up conversations, that what can happen is generalizing and generalizing and generalizing, and it can really excel. And it's not clear at all.
No.
Yeah.
No. And of course in that request there's buying time for you. There is also, although you said it's not empathizing, but there is also actually a flavor of acknowledgement of my distress, and not making it wrong. And then there's another piece which is really important, which is inviting me actually to kind of pause and bring more clarity, which in a non-confrontational, non-blaming way is actually inviting me to take more responsibility for what it is that I'm expressing. And as we've talked about before in these conversations, I guess when we do that, even as the angry attacking one initially, I'm invited to get closer to what it is that I'm really feeling and really needing.
Yeah.
And doing that is soothing. It's not going to completely diffuse the situation immediately, but it's a little window, a little opening for the really angry, distressed, wound up person to come closer to themselves, because they've left already as well. They're not deeply within themselves if they're expressing in that way. And so anything that we can do to support ourselves to stay grounded and connected and also to invite the other person to come back a bit is going to be helpful.
Yeah, so one of the ways that we could do that would be to actually really listen carefully and then reflect back whatever it is that we believe we're hearing. That's another way to get clarity. Is it that you're wanting me to hear, and then blah, 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 whatever it is? Yeah. And depending on who it is, if we use the words the other person used, then they can feel heard. And that, again, can start to soothe the nervous system and the limbic system.
And it reminds us, even if it's not an overt kind of conscious reminder, if you like, that there's another human being on the other side. It's actually reminding both parties that there's a human being.
Yeah.
That they're communicating with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another way that we can, of using resonant language skills, if we have conversations and every sentence that we say, I would have an I and a you in it. And I'd want to be tracking that I'm not repeating my sentences, but that they would be fresh ones, and that every time, so that it's a language that includes both of us, not just all of my stuff or all of your stuff, but there's a mutuality in the expression itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Mm. I know that a lot of people, you know, when we talk about this resonant language skills or offering empathy in a conflict moment like this one, are really afraid that means they're giving away their own feelings or experience. And I'm sort of wondering whether it might be helpful for us to talk a little bit about maybe even our own experience of what it's actually like to do what we're talking about in a conflictual conversation, and whether it does actually feel as though we're giving our own feelings away. Because my experience of it is that it actually doesn't. That doing the kind of resonant communication that you're talking about, Gloria, actually keeps me more present,
Yeah,
and more connected to my own feelings and needs as the conversation unfolds, and therefore more able to express them than if I've gone into and kind of tried to cut myself off from the other person as a defensive, protective kind of mechanism.
Yeah. Well, what can happen for us if we do go into that heightened state is we can actually start to just shunt all of our experience into our implicit. And we won't actually remember. We had one heck of a blowout, but we cannot tell you exactly what happened or what was said. And so when we can slow the conversation down through reflecting and asking for smaller bites, like I'm really getting this is important to you, and I want to be able to catch it. So can I reflect what I'm hearing you say to make sure I'm understanding? So right there, that's a real relational, that it matters.
Yeah.
And when I listen to you and then you're able to calm, then once I've got what it is you wanted me to hear, I can say, well, would you be willing to hear how I'm sitting with that? And so being able to slow it down in 40 words or less is what Marshall Rosenberg always said, because we're not going to be able to retain what the other person says. So we need to share small bites back and forth.
Yeah. Which I as you described that, I think also about when we're sharing small bites back and forth, we're actually co-creating. It's almost like a web that can actually hold both of us. Yeah.
Yeah, it creates the container.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe because it's spring here, I'm thinking about weaving a bird's nest maybe as well. But this and it doesn't matter if to begin with, or even through the conversation, one person's doing a little bit more of the weaving. It's still a container that's going to hold both a lot more effectively than this. Retreating to a non-relational, heightened state on both sides.
Yeah, it does not require that both people actually have the resonant language skills. All it requires is one person to be willing to choose relationship over strategy. And then you actually have a place where you can begin to co-create just by your own authentic curiosity and warmth and interest. Empathizing with somebody or reflecting what you're hearing them say does not mean you're agreeing with them. It just means you're a very good communicator, and that you can catch and get what it's like for this other person to be having the experience they're having. And many times when I've done this with somebody that I'm not agreeing with at all, once I actually understand with compassion how it is that they perceive, it actually opens my heart wider. And then I may not still agree with them, but I'm going to have a lot more compassion for how they perceive life. And it doesn't make them right or wrong. It just makes them have a different perception than I do.
Yeah. And agreeing doesn't really necessarily come into it in many situations.
No.
Hey, it's just
Yeah.
like, yeah. But I'm thinking that this in there somewhere is there's a lot of rich stuff about our implicit model of power that sits underneath conversations being difficult or not. In that, I think part of what drives the perception of conversations being difficult is that power over kind of win-lose model that we carry implicitly because our culture promotes it and reinforces it all over the place. And so every time we're anticipating a conflict with somebody, we're coming to it from the perspective of someone is going to win and someone is going to lose. And that amps up the fear and the aggression often. Yeah,
it can. And so for me to be able to stay curious is going to be like my best friend. When I can stay curious, it's going to help me to stay present and listening rather than going into my mind and into my default and into my worries and into my fear, which is shifting left and leaving the relationship.
Yes.
I want to be able to continue to catch when I do that and be relational with myself to help myself stay forward and interested in the conversation.
Yeah.
And there's no saying, even if the other person doesn't want to call a pause, we can still call a pause. We can also we can name what we're willing to do and what we're not willing to do.
Yeah.
There's no have to's to have the conversation. We need to give ourselves permission to be congruent ourselves.
I'm thinking too that the kind of anxiety that can arise when we are anticipating having a conversation like this, as well as being driven, by our expectations of someone winning and someone losing, really wanting to acknowledge how rare the kind of curiosity, relational kind of curiosity and attention and presence is in many people's experience. And so it can be really difficult to believe that it's possible to have a conversation like this and not be traumatized by it in some way, or to lose the relationship with the person that we need to have the conversation with. The idea that and so then of course people anticipate the conversation and spend a lot of time and energy often trying to figure out strategy how to have it in a perfect way to minimize the likelihood of the other person reacting in a way that they're afraid they won't be able to handle. And that's really not that helpful.
No, what I would really highly suggest to any of our listeners or viewers, if they know that there's a difficult conversation and they are really worried about whether they're going to be able to have that conversation without it blowing up, is to actually find someone that's skilled in these ways to mediate. And I know that it's been miraculous. I've worked with many different couples and many different groups, and to be able to slow the conversation down, to have an agreement about what the container looks like, so that each person actually has the experience that they do matter and that they will be heard. And then to slow them down and actually support them to be able to hear one another and to reflect what they heard. And just that back and forth, taking that time um, to watch their bodies just literally start to relax.
Yeah.
And it can be very meaningful. There are some people that will think, oh, I don't have time to do that. But when you take the time to do that at the beginning, what it does is it actually creates a new pathway going forward of what's possible. So you don't have to go down that rocky, bumpy road of that's aggressive.
Mm.
But there can be a mutuality and an agreement about how to agree to disagree. That can be
Yes.
quite beautiful.
Yes. Sounds like you're talking about kind of like the safety agreement that might be established at the beginning of that kind of work, as well as then what is scaffolded by the facilitator of those conversations, so that people can start to, it's partly about learning skills, but it's partly about actually having the experience of being held safely in that conversation, so that at that implicit level we can start to believe that it can be safe.
And that we matter.
And that we matter. Yeah.
Yeah, because I believe that's really at the heart of a lot of conflict, is the belief that we don't matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or our experience doesn't matter.
Mm.
And so that we feel minimized or marginalized or and so having the experience really does inform the body.
Yeah. Because that's where a lot of this is held.
Yes.
Yeah, and sort of really thinking, I guess just in this moment, reaffirming for myself perhaps the importance and the difference between trying to learn these sorts of skills in a cognitive way versus allowing ourselves to have the experience of safety and mattering as we're learning how to express what we need to express and to hear the other deeply. This is not a really cognitive process. It can't be.
Well, we want to be able to, I guess, the weaving that you were talking about before, when we can have the cognitive process be in service of the experience. So many times in workshops or group activities that I'll do is there'll be some little resource that we'll have, but then we step into the experience and we get to play with it. And when we can play with the experience and have the container be already that it's okay for it to be messy and perfectly imperfect, then there's something that can happen within us where we start to discover what's possible through our experience.
Yeah. And it's a beautifully disorienting experience that sometimes, isn't it?
I call it a disconfirming experience. Yeah.
It's a disconfirming experience. It's sort of it's almost like sometimes when we have that, or observe others having that kind of experience, there's this kind of, it's almost like an internal listening with a bit of puzzlement sometimes on people's faces, because they're noticing that there's something very different happening, and they're not quite sure what it is, but it feels good, but it also feels a little bit unfamiliar, and therefore and it can take quite a bit of time for words to be available to express the shift that's happening.
Yeah.
And even when they do come, there'll be often not too many words. There'll be more resonant words, but there'll be fewer of them, perhaps, to describe what's going on. Apprehended.
So the different ways that these kinds of things can show up, we were going to kind of explore that too. And again, I think, as we said before, it's going to depend upon each individual person's life experiences. But it's helpful to be aware of the different circuits of emotion and motivation.
Mm.
And
Mm.
when we can become aware of those, they can be strands that can help us to stay present when we can recognize them.
Yes. Yeah. So would you like to just say a little more about the circuits of emotion and how that process of recognition might work and be supportive for people?
Well, for myself, I would refer people to, I'll put in a plug for Sarah Payton's book, The Your Resonant Self, that we both love. And she does a beautiful job of explaining the circuits, and but in words that are easy to digest, and lots of stories to help assimilate the information.
Yeah.
For myself, my let's see, my rage circuitry, which would contain anger, was a place I just wasn't allowed for me. And so if I ever felt angry, what I would find myself doing was crying. And then I'd be so upset that I'm crying because I'm actually angry. But until I was able to do some processes to untangle that, I didn't actually have access to my healthy anger. So one of the things that can happen for us, if we had the experience in our life at some point where a certain emotion was not allowed, then we're going to actually divert that emotion to a different circuit.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've worked with people for whom, just to expand that example a little, anger was not allowed, for whom the diversion will take the path of sadness, but actually very, very intensely move into despair, or even a desire to not exist.
Yeah.
And absolutely, when we start unraveling that and kind of teasing apart and making space for that rage circuit to be allowed, realizing that there's all this life energy that has been unable to be expressed because of that diversion process, and that it's really, really important to have room for, feel comfortable with, feel able to express anger.
Yeah. Well, and then there's also fear. There's a healthy fear that can come up. And so if we were not allowed to express our fear, I've had some clients that then they would express it with anger. Anytime they got scared, they'd get mad. It's a way to try to protect self. Because I see that rage circuitry as protection is what it's, it's real gift.
Yeah, that's right. That's
right. Yeah.
Yeah, but if it's being engaged in a way that, I don't know if this language is quite right, but blocks awareness of the real need,
yeah,
then it becomes not so effective in service of well-being.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think what we're kind of moving towards in what we're discussing now is that that the circuits that we easily do or don't have access to, and another way of thinking about that would be to talk about our window of welcome for different emotions, which I know, we have talked about previously, but they're kind of related concepts, powerfully shape what kinds of conversations we're going to find difficult.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And as a very different kind of example, I was talking with my daughter the other night about some stuff that was going on in her social group at school, and I was very aware actually that I was able to be more present to that conversation than I would have been in the past, because I've worked really hard in the last few years to expand my window of welcome for disappointment and hurt, And kind of just noticing that I think in the past I would have probably shifted more into strategy in a conversation like that, trying to fix it, because it was really hard for me to just sit open-heartedly and really, really listen and invite her to express the hurt and disappointment that she was feeling, because I didn't want to go there. Yeah. And this time really noticing that I could sit in that as long as she needed me to. And then right at the end of the conversation, we moved quite naturally to exploring, well, I wonder what choices you might have about, are there conversations you want to have with any of your friends about this? What might those look like? But that was a little piece at the end, rather than in the past. That's where I would have gone pretty quick.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm hearing in that is, as you have developed your own window of welcome to expand, you have new territory that you can sit with others, and out of that connection, out of that resonant field, the strategy comes up at the end, and it's quite easy.
Yes.
It just emerges out of it.
Yeah. And is able to be acted on relatively easily. I think that's the other part, because it's almost as though in that example, if I in my discomfort had rushed to try and pull my daughter into strategizing, there would have been a whole kind of left out piece of her experience, which would have been still sitting there needing to be expressed and heard and held. And that can become resistance to taking action, because that bit's been missed. And so it's kind of it's sort of sitting, hunkering down there, wanting to be heard, and then we don't want to rush on to taking the logical action to resolve the problem, because there's this whole well of feeling that needs to be made space for first.
Yeah, so what's quite lovely is, with this way of being in the world, with this way of being able to be with our own uncomfortable discomfort, to recognize, for me, it's recognizing when I feel discomfort, it's letting me know that something's arising for integration or for healing. There's something new that's emerging, a new place I can explore when I'm willing to take the time to be with it. And in that, there's a discovery process too, when we go in that kind of exploration in relationship with another being, that we both end up being the winner. We talked about earlier, win-lose, but we're both the winner when we actually can take the time to sit with one another's discomfort and understand what's underneath it, and really hear that and honor that. And we may still we may not agree with each other, but at least we will have an understanding that's mutual. And that in itself is the connection piece.
That's right. And I guess there's also a sort of short-term, long-term piece in here, because it's like, we may not agree with each other on this particular thing in the short term, but we're a heck of a lot more likely to be able to stay in relationship over the long term, and to find ways of moving forward together if we can come to difficult conversations in the way that we're exploring today.
And when we're willing to do that, we're actually building a bridge of trust between us. Trust that even if we have difficult conversations, that we believe and we know through our experiences that we will be heard, we will hear one another. We will have understanding and be understood. So that again, that mutuality, that we both matter. And that's so important.
It is. Yeah. And so if people want To reach out to you, Gloria, to get some support with having difficult conversations. How might they do that?
You can reach me through my website at Healing You Sanctuary. Nope, yep, that's it. I just had a little blip about what is it? HealingYouSanctuary.com. That's me, yes.
It is you.
And how about you? For people?
Yeah, same. You can reach me through my website, which is www.ingridgunby.com or potent.co.nz. They take you to the same place. Yeah.
Quite lovely.
Thank
Well,
you
I
for
enjoyed our conversation today. And I look
Yes,
forward to more in the future.
yes, me too. Thank you.
Mhm.